I'd like to welcome everyone today to DairyXNet's webinar entitled Basic Vaccinology, Why Vaccines Work or Don't Work. I'd first like to introduce myself. I'm Donna Amaral Phillips, Extension Dairy Specialist at the University of Kentucky and the Project Team Leader for DairyXNet. I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's speaker, Dr. Dan Grooms. He is a native of Central Ohio, where he grew up in a small commercial cow-calf operation. He received his BS degree in animal science from Cornell University, his DVM degree from The Ohio State University. Upon graduating from the Ohio State University, he went into private practice in Central Ohio for 5 years. He then returned to Ohio State and received his PhD in veterinary preventative medicine. Upon graduation, he joined the faculty at Michigan State University in the Department of Large Animal Clinical Sciences. He is currently president of the American Association of Bovine Practitioners. His extension and research activities have focused on the control and prevention of infectious diseases in cattle. He is also actively involved in beef quality assurance, bull breeding soundness exam programs, pre-harvest food safety, biosecurity, emergency preparedness, and farm security initiatives in his state. With that, we'd like to welcome today Dr. Dan Grooms for our webinar. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Donna, and good afternoon to everybody that has joined us on here today. First of all, today's topic is we're going to be talking about vaccinology, basic things about why vaccines might work, and then also maybe more importantly, why they may not work. So here are the specific objectives of today's lecture. First of all, what we're going to talk about, first of all, is talk a little bit about what vaccines are. Then we're going to touch on different types of vaccines. I think it's really important that folks understand the different types of vaccines and the pros and cons between different types of vaccines. We're then going to spend a little bit of time about talking about why vaccines fail. And sometimes people want to blame everything on vaccines, and sometimes vaccines do not work like we would like to. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on talking about why they may not work as well as we would like. Within vaccine failure, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on vaccine handling, because when vaccines do fail, it turns out that much of the failure is due to poor handling of the vaccines. I do then want to touch on the fact that using vaccines does come with some risk at time, and so I want to talk a little bit about risks of using vaccines. And then finally, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on kind of the art of developing a vaccine protocol for an operation. There's more that goes into developing a vaccine program than just going to a catalog and selecting vaccines that you might want to use. So, start with, just want to remind everybody what vaccines are. And essentially, vaccines are substances that are designed to stimulate an immune response. So we're actually targeting an animal or a human's immune system so that immune system is actually able to respond to some type of a pathogen when it actually becomes exposed to it. So our goal here is to reduce the risk of a detrimental condition. So the substances that are given to stimulate the immune system are what we call antigens. And antigens are what the immune system, so the immune system in a cow or the immune system in yourself, are looking for in order to develop an immune response. And this immune response is not just a simple response. It's a very complex response to the antigen. And in fact, the response varies depending on the different type of antigens that are exposed to the immune system. So an immune response to a virus, it would be much, much different than an immune response to, let's say, a bacteria. So making sure that we have an effective immune response, a complex immune response to the different antigens, is incredibly important to have an effective response. One thing that you'll hear me say several times today is that no vaccines are 100% effective. There is no silver bullet in the way of vaccines where if we administer that vaccine, we can protect the animal 100%. And there's a variety of reasons for that, and we'll talk about that later. But one take-home point from today's lecture is that no vaccine is 100% effective in preventing disease. And then obviously the detrimental conditions that we're trying to prevent with vaccines include disease, so animals getting sick, different types of pathology, and ultimately, in some cases, the death of the animal. So those are the detrimental conditions that we're aiming for when we develop a vaccine program. So let's talk a little bit about different types of vaccines, because it's really, really important to understand the pros and cons and actually what different types of vaccines are trying to do for us. And up here on your slide right now are a variety of different types of vaccines. We're going to focus in on three of these actually, or actually four of these. We're going to talk about attenuated vaccines, which are also known as modified live vaccines. We're going to talk about killed vaccines. Let me pull up my arrow here. We're going to talk about killed vaccines. We're also going to talk a little bit about toxoids, just so people understand what the difference between a toxoid is versus a killed or attenuated vaccine. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about autogenous vaccines, because often as I work with producers here in the state of Michigan as well as other states, I get questions about autogenous vaccines. The other vaccines on here are less commonly used, and so we're not going to spend time on those, but do understand, especially as technology advances, that in the future we'll probably start seeing more and more technologically advanced vaccines, such as recombinant vaccines, available for producers. Okay, so the first type of vaccine I want to talk about is called an attenuated vaccine. This is also probably more commonly known as modified live vaccines, or some people will refer to them as live vaccines. So it's really important to understand that these vaccines are actually live replicating organisms, whether we're talking about viruses or bacteria. But something has been done to that organism, that virus or that bacteria, to manipulate or reduce the ability of that virus or bacteria to cause disease. So that's where we get the word modified or attenuated. So they're actual live bacteria or live viruses that have been modified so that they have a reduced chance, and I don't say zero chance, but I say reduced chance of causing disease. The important thing to understand about modified live vaccines or attenuated vaccines, that in order for them to work and stimulate the immune response that they were designed to stimulate, they must be able to replicate within the animal that they're given to. So if we give that modified live virus vaccine to an animal, that modified live bacterial vaccine to an animal, in order for it to work properly, it must be able to replicate. And we'll talk a little bit about why this can be problematic when we talk about vaccine failures. So advantages of attenuated or modified live vaccines. First of all, these types of vaccines most closely simulate a natural infection. So this makes total sense. If we give the actual organism that's able to actually replicate, it's a live organism, it's able to replicate within the animal, it's most likely to stimulate it's most likely to mimic a true natural infection, and obviously the type of immunity that develops is probably going to be a more effective one. This is really, really important when we're trying to stimulate immune responses to organisms that actually live within the cells of an infected animal. And this is really, really true for viruses. Viruses live within the cells and replicate within the cells of animals. And as it turns out, modified live virus or virus vaccines are much more capable of stimulating a response that's capable of controlling those. Another advantage is that adjuvants are not typically necessary to make the vaccines effective. And we're going to talk a little bit more about adjuvants here in a second. But essentially, adjuvants are things that we put in vaccines to help modify or improve the immune response from the vaccine. So in general, attenuated vaccines or modified live vaccines do not require adjuvants. And then the last thing from an advantageous standpoint is that modified live vaccines typically are cheaper than their killed cousins. Okay, so the example I have up here, Pyramid 5, which is a commonly used modified live virus vaccine. If you went to a catalog and looked up the price of a 10-dose vial of that vaccine, it's right now around $12, whereas its killed cousin for 10 doses is about $5 more. So on a dose-per-dose comparison, killed vaccines are typically more expensive than modified live vaccines. Some disadvantages. Well, given the fact that they are live replicating organisms, there is a potential for the organisms to cause pathology. Hopefully, the pathology, if it does occur, is much, much reduced. But we have to keep in mind that it can occur. And some examples of this would be the vaccine that we commonly use for vaccinating young calves against brucellosis is a modified live bacterial vaccine. And this vaccine can cause mild fever and sign and illness in calves. Modified live bovine viral diarrhea virus and IBR virus are commonly used, and we need to understand that those viruses, if used incorrectly or used in the wrong conditions, can cause some pathology. The other potential problem is because they are modified live organisms, there is a very, very low risk that they could revert from a modified version of the virus or the bacteria to a fully virulent version. Now, this is a very low risk, and it's certainly something that we typically don't worry too much about, but I think it's important that we always keep that in mind, that this could occur. A couple other things is because of the way the vaccines are manufactured, there has been historically problems with contamination of modified live or attenuated vaccines. In reality, this is less of a problem today because of the strict quality control that goes into making vaccines. And then the last disadvantage is stability. And we're going to talk about stability when we talk about vaccine failure, but attenuated vaccines tend to be less stable than killed vaccines simply because we have to maintain the ability of that virus or that bacteria to replicate, and if something happens to damage that ability to replicate, then the vaccine will not work very well. So because of this, stability can be an issue with these types of vaccines. Killed vaccines is another very commonly used type of vaccine. Essentially, killed vaccines are the organism that we're interested in stimulating an immune response, and they've been killed, okay? So we've done something in the laboratory to basically inactivate that virus or that bacteria. And by the way, if you ever hear veterinarians talking about, or you hear me talking about a Bactrin essentially is a killed bacterial suspension. So anytime we're talking about Bactrin, we're talking about a killed bacterial vaccine. The key to killed vaccines being effective is that during the killing process of that virus or that bacteria, we actually maintain the antigenic integrity of that virus or bacteria. So basically, we kill the bacteria, we kill the virus, but we basically don't change the way the virus or bacteria looks to the immune system. So this is really, really important. If we change the way the virus looks when we kill it, or if we change the way the bacteria looks when we kill it, then that's going to reduce the chance of that killed vaccine in stimulating a good response. I will mention, and we're going to talk about adjuvants here in a second, is that often killed vaccines require adjuvants being added to the vaccine to actually stimulate a robust immune response. So adjuvants, real quick, are, as we mentioned, are things that are often added to vaccines to help stimulate an immune response, and also in some cases stabilize the vaccines. These adjuvants do not actually confer immunity. They just basically help to improve the response to that vaccine. There's a couple different mechanisms that are used, general mechanisms that are used. One is where we use oil adjuvants, which actually create a depot within the injection site. And so this depot, actually what it does is prolong the exposure of the immune system to the antigen. So basically you just create a depot effect that allows the immune system a longer time to recognize the antigen and then hopefully stimulate an immune response. The other type of adjuvant that is commonly used are what are called irritants. And common irritants include aluminum hydroxide, or in some cases some very low virulence toxins. And essentially what these irritants do is they, just like the name suggests, they basically cause irritation around the injection site where we gave the vaccine, and this tends to amplify their immune response to the antigens which were injected. I just want to mention, and I'll allude to this a couple times, is that adjuvants are not innocuous. And what I mean by that is, on occasion, adjuvants can actually cause some pathology or disease problems, so we need to keep that in the back of our mind. Advantages of kill vaccines is, in general, they're safer. There's no disease due to virulent organisms, less ability for them to revert to, or actually no ability for them to revert to a pathological form, have less problems with contamination, and in general, the stability of the vaccines are much greater. Disadvantages, with kill vaccines, we have a greater risk of what are called hypersensitivity reactions, and we're going to talk about allergic or anaphylactic reactions here a little bit later. But hypersensitivity reactions occur due to the adjuvants that we put in there, sometimes due to toxins that are included in the vaccines, and also we get hypersensitivity reactions because we have to use a lot more antigen in the vaccine to get an immune response. So we have an increased risk of hypersensitivity reactions or allergic reactions with kill vaccines. Also, and this is true of our bacterial vaccines, endotoxins often are released during the killing process of these vaccines, and endotoxins obviously can cause some disease problems. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this here later on. And then, as we've already mentioned, kill vaccines typically are more expensive than our modified live cousins. Just real quick, I want to mention toxoids. So toxoids are actually vaccines that are directed against toxins that are produced by bacterial infections specifically. So in this case, where we have bacterial infections where toxins are the major virulence factor, the major thing that causes disease, what we try to do is actually stimulate an immune response against the toxin and not necessarily against the bacteria. So some examples of this, which are commonly used in veterinary medicine or even in human medicine. For instance, most everybody involved in agriculture has been vaccinated against tetanus. Well, you're not specifically vaccinated against the bacteria, but you're vaccinated against the toxin which is produced by tetanus. So you received a tetanus toxoid vaccine, which is developed or has stimulated an immune response in you against the toxoid produced by the Clostridial tetani bacteria. Similarly, there's a bacteria that is commonly associated with bovine respiratory disease in cattle. It's called Mannheimia hemolytica. The major virulence factor, the major thing that bacteria produces to cause disease is a toxin called a leukotoxin. And as it turns out, if we use a vaccine that specifically targets that leukotoxin, our protection against pneumonia from Mannheimia hemolytica is greatly increased. Last thing I'll mention real quick is autogenous vaccines. Autogenous vaccines are made specifically for farm-specific pathogens. So let's say that your veterinarian decides that you have a specific virus or bacteria in your operation for which no commercial vaccine is available. They can have a vaccine made against that specific pathogen. All right. Just a couple things to know in that by rule, that vaccine can only be used on the farm that it was created for. Okay, so you can't have an autogenous vaccine made for farmer A and then farmer B cannot use that vaccine by law. So some common organisms that autogenous vaccines often are used against include Mycoplasma bovis, which is a bacteria that is associated with primarily respiratory disease in cattle, Clostridium perfringens, which is another fairly common gastrointestinal bacteria, and then Staph aureus, which most every dairy operation is familiar with as a cause of mastitis. There have been autogenous vaccine attempts being made to control that bacterial infection. So now I want to transition into vaccine failure and why vaccines might fail. And I think it's really important to understand why vaccines might fail, because if you understand why they fail, hopefully you can take the steps to reduce the risk that they will cause problems. So again, I want to come back to this point is we need to remember that vaccines are not 100% effective. They are a tool to use in conjunction with other disease control tools in your overall disease control program. So you're using vaccines in conjunction with sanitation, in conjunction with biosecurity, in conjunction with good nutrition. It's one tool in your total toolbox for disease control. However, having said that, there are things that we can do to make sure that the vaccines, when administered, do what we hope that they will do. So let me back up here. I tend to break up why vaccines fail into two distinct categories. One is things that we do by incorrectly administering the vaccine, and then things that occur when we correctly administer the vaccine, but the vaccine still fails. So I'm going to talk about these two different kind of broad topics with respects to vaccine failure. So first one is where we incorrectly administer the vaccine. And folks, this all comes down to not reading the label directions, okay? Every vaccine comes with label directions, and those label directions were developed by the vaccine manufacturers to ensure that a proper or as efficient as possible vaccine response occurs, or immune response occurs to the vaccines, okay? And it amazes me how often people have not read the label of vaccines and therefore don't understand how the vaccine needs to be administered. So I would encourage everybody when using vaccines in their operation to follow or read the vaccine and follow the vaccine label recommendations. And here's a vaccine from a commonly used vaccine in dairy operations. This is Triangle 10, which is a vaccine against multiple viruses that are common in dairy operations, as well as leptospirosis bacteria. And I just want to point out, several things that are in the label directions that are important, and if not followed correctly, could lead to either vaccine failure or certainly a less effective response. So in this one I have underlined here, first of all, the dose is a 5 ml dose. Okay, it's not a 2 ml dose, it's not a 10 ml dose, it's a 5 ml dose that is given either in the muscle or under the skin. And if you notice here, with this vaccine, it needs to be repeated in 14 to 28 days when you initially vaccinate an animal. Okay, so you don't just give this vaccine once and then forget about it. Initially, it has to be given twice, 14 to 28 days apart, in order for it to work correctly. And then after that, the vaccine is given annually. Okay, the important thing with killed vaccines is that they need to be given twice initially. Another thing on the directions here for this vaccine is that calves vaccinated under 6 months of age should be revaccinated at 6 months of age. So in this case, the manufacturers recommend that if we start a vaccine program at less than 6 months of age, we almost need to restart it at 6 months of age. Okay, and this has a lot to do with the immaturity of a young calf's immune system, and the need to really start the vaccine program once that immune system has matured. And then just a couple other things down here under precautions. It talks about how you ought to store it. So it needs to be stored, in this case, at 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which is refrigeration temperature. We need to avoid freezing. And by the way, all vaccines, so you all know, have slaughter withdrawals on them. And so vaccinating an animal, basically, you cannot slaughter that animal, sell that animal for slaughter for 21 days. So bottom line is I would encourage you to follow the vaccine label recommendations as close as possible. Now I just want to talk real quick a case example of a dairy disaster that we recently were involved with, where people did not read the label and it ended up in a disaster. So this was a 150 cow lactating cow dairy farm here in Michigan that we got involved because of an acute outbreak of pneumonia in the lactating herd. We went out with students and did necropsies on several animals that had died, and the bottom line is the animals had died from severe, what was characterized as acute bronchopneumonia, and we found two organisms in the pneumonia. One was bovine respiratory syncytial virus, also known as BRSV virus, and the other was Mannheimia, that actually should be Mannheimia hemolytica, which is that common bacteria that's associated with pneumonia. Of the 150 cows in this lactating herd, 45 of them died. okay? And in the control program that was instituted, we actually instituted, we treated the entire herd with ampicillin to try to quiet down the respiratory disease outbreak. And because of that long treatment with ampicillin, basically the herd lost milk production for 1 week. So as you can imagine, because of the basically third of the herd that was lost, plus the significant loss in milk production, this was a pretty significant economic blow to this operation. So this is just a picture of, number one, some of the cows affected by the disease up in your upper left-hand corner, and then a picture of the lungs from one of the cows that died from this pneumonia outbreak. So during the investigation, more importantly, we came in to try to figure out what had happened, and during our investigation, this is what we found. First of all, there was a recent purchase of a new bull to basically serve as their cleanup bull, and this was actually the first introduction of a new animal into this herd in over 1 year. So we suspect that this was probably the source of the virus, in this case BRSV, or even the bacteria that caused the disease. Most importantly is that this herd had been using a modified live viral vaccine that did not include bovine respiratory syncytial virus, so that BRSV virus. And the herd owners admitted that they had not read the label and basically had purchased from a catalog because it was the least expensive vaccine. And in what I have here is basically a picture of the cost of vaccines. One actually was the vaccine used in this case, which was PregGuard Gold, which is a vaccine that does not include BRSV. And you can see that the price was about $16 for 10 doses, or for 50 doses, I should say, as compared to something such as Bovishield Gold, which includes BRSV, and this vaccine was about 3 times or twice the cost, okay? And essentially the owners admitted that they had chosen the vaccine on the right here because it was least expensive, but they never understood that it did not include BRSV in the vaccine. So the outcome was this primary BRSV outbreak with secondary Mannheimia hemolytic pneumonia in a basically a naive herd when it came to BRSV, and this led to the disaster which we saw. So now I want to switch gears and just talk about vaccine failure when we correctly administer the vaccine, but we still maybe get a less efficient vaccine response or immune response than we would like. And the first one has to do with poor vaccine handling. And as I talk with pharmaceutical companies and ask what's the most common thing they see when it comes to what is expected as less than efficient vaccine response, it usually comes down to poor vaccine handling. So I just want to talk a little bit about different things that can cause vaccine failure when we fail to handle vaccines correctly. So again, let's all remember that vaccines are biological in nature, therefore they are sensitive to the environment. If we don't handle them correctly, then there's probably going to be damage to the antigens which are in that vaccine, and that's going to give the immune system less of a chance to respond to that vaccine. So bottom line is improper vaccine handling equals vaccine failure. So just some things to keep in mind. First of all, if you read the labels, all labels will say that vaccines need to be restored or stored at refrigeration temperatures, which is essentially 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And as I'm sure you all know, if you've been on many farms like I have, often the refrigerator that's in the milk house is often old, maybe a refrigerator that you're retired from the house. So it's not a bad idea to have an internal thermometer to monitor the refrigerator temperature and make sure that it's actually at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. More importantly is vaccines should not be frozen, so they should be kept in the refrigeration part of the refrigerator and not in the temperature part or in the freezer part of the refrigerator. When transporting vaccines to the field or to, we need to back up one slide, sorry folks. Thank you very much. Oops, go forward one. Yeah, I've lost control of the vaccine. There we go. That's perfect. Thank you very much. When when transporting vaccines to wherever you're going to administer them, they need to be transported in a cooler and also stored in a cooler in the working area. So one of the biggest mistakes I see, especially with beef producers, is that they transport vaccines out into the field, and the working facility may be out in the middle of a field, and they expose the vaccines to warm conditions or hot conditions, and this can quickly inactivate vaccines. So I want to keep in mind that we need to protect vaccines from sunlight. UV light is a great disinfectant. Okay, it's a great disinfectant, so exposing vaccines to sunlight will quickly inactivate or make vaccines less effective. So if working with vaccines in an area where we have direct exposure to sunlight, we need to make sure that those vaccines are kept in a covered container. So keeping them in that cooler, such as we have right here, is a good idea when you're out in your working environment. So I want to ask the folks out that are listening, I'm going to do a quick poll here real quick. One of the problems we run into, especially with modified live vaccines, is that on occasion we have to mix those vaccines together. We have to mix a dried kind of powdery part of the vaccine, and we have to mix it with a liquid part. And so my question to you is, after mixing, say, a modified live virus vaccine together, how long is it good for after you mix that vaccine together? Is it 4 hours? Is it 4 days? Is it 4 weeks? Or is it 4 months? In other words, once you mix those two together, how long do you have before basically that vaccine is not as effective as it was when we first mixed it? I'll just give you a second to answer that. And we've got several answers, and everybody that has answered so far has said 4 hours, and that is, oops, now we got 6 people, excellent. So everybody's saying 4 hours, which is the correct response. I'm going to go ahead and close that, go on the next slide. So when we are using vaccines that need to be mixed together, and in most cases these are modified live vaccines, whether it be viral vaccines or bacterial vaccines, basically we need to mix that vaccine so that we can use it within 4 hours. So what we recommend is that we mix enough vaccines that we know we can use within 30 minutes and then keep remixing the vaccine as needed. But after 4 hours, basically the virus or the bacteria that's in the vaccine has started to deteriorate at that point and will no longer be able to replicate within the animal, and stimulate the immune response that is expected. And I don't know how many times I've worked with producers and we talk about this and we find out that they've been mixing modified live virus vaccines. They'll mix the bottle up, they'll only use 2 or 3 doses, and then they'll stick it in the refrigerator, and then they'll get that bottle back out a week later and start to use it again. And the bottom line is after 4 hours, that vaccine really is ineffective at that point. Last thing I just want to mention with regards to vaccine handling is that we need to protect the vaccines from contamination. Very often in farms, we're going into bottles multiple times to pull out doses of vaccines and administer to the animals, and it's really, really important that we don't enter those bottles with dirty needles for a couple reasons. Number one is if we go in there with dirty needles, we're going to inject bacteria or fungi or molds or viruses or whatever that then are going to be injected with the vaccine into the animal. And then especially with killed vaccines, where we may reuse them if we properly store them, those vaccines actually in some cases have material in them that will allow the bacteria or molds or fungus to actually replicate within the vial. So it's really, really important to make sure that we use clean needles when we enter bottles of vaccines and pull out the doses that we're going to administer to the animals. I guess I do have one other thing. I just do want to mention that we also, in addition to protecting the vaccines, we need to protect the devices that we actually administer the vaccines with, so syringes and needles. We need to make sure those syringes and needles are properly taken care of. We need to make sure that they're not hot when we administer vaccines. And I've seen this plenty of times where a pistol grip syringe, since it's the one we have here, was kept on the, say, the dashboard of a truck in the middle of the summer, and then they pull the syringe out, and it's hot, as you can imagine, being on the dashboard of the truck. And then as soon as they pull a vaccine in that hot syringe, it basically just cooks the virus or the bacteria that's in that vaccine. So we need to protect these syringes from heat. And then also, if we're using syringes that we use multiple times and we want to clean them between uses, we recommend that you only use hot water. Never use disinfectants to clean syringes that are going to be used to administer vaccines. By their nature, disinfectants leave residues behind, and those residues, obviously, when they come in contact with vaccines, will inactivate the vaccines and make them useless. So only use hot water to clean syringes that you're going to use for vaccines, and then after you have thoroughly rinsed them with hot water, just let them air dry. Okay, last slide with respects to vaccine failure. So we've already talked about poor vaccine handling, but there are many other things that can lead to vaccine failure despite proper administration. And I just want to list out a few here real quick. First of all, sometimes it may be that we've used the wrong vaccine, okay? As an example, if we want to be vaccinating animals against tetanus, most of our common Clostridial vaccines, which tetanus is a Clostridial bacteria, most of our common Clostridial vaccines do not include tetanus in them, okay? You have to get a special vaccine, a special Clostridial vaccine that includes tetanus in them to protect against tetanus, all right? So making sure you have the right vaccine is really, really important. Antigenic differences. In some cases, our bacteria or our viruses have so much diversity out in the field that our vaccines can't stimulate an immune response that can cover the diversity of different field strains that are out there. And a perfect example of this is bovine viral diarrhea virus. There are thousands of different strains of BVD virus that are circulating in the field. And to expect one vaccine to protect against all those different strains is really not realistic. It may do a really, really good job against some of the strains of BVD virus, but not so good a job against other strains. So antigenic differences can lead to less efficient vaccine efficacy. Vaccine timing or bad timing. Okay, so we give vaccines at the wrong time, and I think the perfect example of this is when we're vaccinating cows to protect against abortions or other fetal pathology. Okay, and when I see people giving vaccines to prevent abortions or other pregnancy wastage, and they're giving the vaccine halfway through pregnancy, I ask them, well, what did you do to protect against the first half of pregnancy? And in many cases, I get these blank stares like, well, I didn't even think about that. So the perfect example is vaccinating cows to protect pregnancies. It makes total sense that we want to administer those vaccines prior to breeding so that we have good protection for the majority of pregnancy. Another thing that often occurs is that we get overwhelming exposure to antigens. So very, very, very common situations occur when we commingle cattle together from lots of different backgrounds. On occasion, we can have such massive exposure to a virus or a bacteria that no matter how well animals are vaccinated, the vaccine can't protect them, or the immune response stimulated from the vaccine can't protect them. This also occurs in situations where we have poor sanitation, so where people are not doing a good job of sanitizing housing facilities, calf hutches, you name it. Doesn't matter how good the immune response that we have there is, if we have overwhelming exposure, we're going to have disease problems. And then the other thing is that on occasion, despite everything we do, animals just fail to respond to the vaccines. Good examples would be if we vaccinate too close to calving. Around calving, we have what is called pre- and postpartum immunosuppression, and cattle aren't going to respond well to vaccines around the time of calving. Sometimes cattle just aren't genetically programmed well to respond to certain vaccines, and that's just a genetic issue, and it's something that occurs on occasion. Nutrition is another one, and we see this a lot, especially in beef operations where animals are in poor nutritional or have poor nutrition, especially during the winter, and they're just unable to respond well to vaccines. The last one I'll just point out is passive immunity, and this is something that occurs commonly with young calves that have gotten colostrum, and certainly we want calves to get lots of colostrum so that they are protected when they're born. But that colostrum and the antibodies that are given or that are in colostrum can actually thwart immune responses to vaccines that are given early in life. Okay, and a perfect example of this, and I just point to this vaccine up here in the corner, which is called CalfGuard. CalfGuard is a very commonly used vaccine in both dairy and beef operations. It's a modified live vaccine directed against bovine rota and coronavirus, which are two common causes of diarrhea. And this vaccine is used to help reduce the risk of calf scours. And this, as I mentioned, this is a modified live virus vaccine. And as you can imagine, for it to work, it has to be able to replicate to stimulate an effective immune response. This vaccine is given to calves at birth. It then basically is swallowed, goes down into the gastrointestinal tract where it actually infects the lining of the intestinal tract, and by infecting the lining of the intestinal tract stimulates an immune response. Well, for this vaccine to be effective, it has to be given before colostrum, because if it's given after colostrum has been administered, then basically the antibodies in the colostrum will inactivate this vaccine before it can ever replicate within the gut. So it's very common to hear people talk about the fact that they'll give their calves colostrum and then they will give their CalfGuard to the calf. Well, at that point, basically, the vaccine will be worthless and will not do the job that it was intended. So a tip is if you are using products such as CalfGuard, these need to be given at least 30 minutes prior to administering colostrum in order for them to have the best chance of working. Okay, I'm going to talk real quick about vaccine risks, because vaccine risks are certainly something that we need to keep in mind. First of all, always keep in mind that vaccines will cause lesions when given, okay? So they're going to cause a lesion whether we give them sub-Q or IM. And this is really important in the beef industry, but certainly something we need to keep in mind in the dairy industry is that eventually dairy cows or dairy calves will become part of the meat supply, and we want to reduce the risk of any injection site lesions showing up when those animals are slaughtered. So make sure that vaccines are given to reduce the risk that we're going to see lesions in especially the edible parts of the animal. We talked earlier about the fact that vaccines can lead to what are called type 1 hypersensitivity, or also known as anaphylaxis or allergic reactions. So we need to keep this in mind. This is especially common, or more common, I should say, with our bacterial Bactrins. So one thing that we can do to reduce first of all, let me talk about the signs that we see with anaphylactic reactions. First of all, they occur almost immediately after after vaccines are administered, and to as long as 30 minutes later. So usually within the first 30 minutes of administering a vaccine, we'll see anaphylactic reactions. They typically cattle present as acute respiratory distress, so you'll see animals just having very difficulty in breathing after administering the vaccine. May also see muscle tremor, salivation, and then very commonly the cattle will basically collapse because of this reaction. So anytime you see any of these types of clinical signs after administering a vaccine, the animal's probably having an allergic reaction or an anaphylactic reaction to the vaccine. Basically, the treatment, or the most common treatment that is recommended, is epinephrine. And so in large operations, we typically recommend that farms keep around epinephrine to administer to any animal that is showing signs of an anaphylactic reaction. And on your slide here basically is what we would use. If we would basically use a 1 to 1,000 dilution of epinephrine. And if we can get into a vein, we'd use a 1/4 to 1/2 cc per 100 pounds. So if you have a 1,000-pound cow, you're basically going to use 5 cc's. Or If you can't get into, say, the jugular vein, then we can give 1 cc per 100 pounds either in the muscle or subcutaneously. So look out for anaphylactic reactions. Anybody that's worked around a lot of cattle over the years and given lots of vaccines probably has seen an anaphylactic reaction. I also want to mention the fact that endotoxins are a problem that we see commonly with what are called gram-negative Bactrins. So endotoxins are actually toxins that are part of the cell wall of bacteria. And when those bacteria are killed, because they are killed vaccines or Bactrins are killed vaccines, then those endotoxins are often released into the product. And so they basically become part of the vaccine. And on occasion, if we have too much endotoxins in the vaccines, we can get some poor outcomes, including anaphylactic reactions. Sometimes we can get calves that just get sick. They get fevers. They don't feel well. If we're giving these vaccines to pregnant cows, we can get abortions. And then people often talk about decreased milk production that occurs after using Bactrins in lactating cows. So in almost all cases, these results are due to endotoxins. So one way to reduce the risk of endotoxins causing major problems is to limit the number of gram-negative Bactrins given at any one time to 2 Bactrins at a time. Okay, so we don't want to give 3 vaccines at one time that have gram-negative bacteria in them. Okay, so we can, and that really reduces the risk of any of the poor outcomes that we have mentioned here. So, as an example, here are several different pathogens or gram-negative pathogens that we have vaccines against. And so let's say that we're going to vaccinate some cows against Clostridium and Histophilus somnus, which is this product right here. And then we're also going to vaccinate the cows against pink eye using a vaccine called Moraxella bovis Bactrin. If we just gave those 2 vaccines, that would be fine. But if we decided to add another vaccine, such as the J5 E. coli mastitis vaccine, then that could potentially lead to some adverse consequences that are not good. And so we would recommend against actually adding this third Bactrin, giving those 3 vaccines at the same time. Okay, we've already talked about residual virulence, and so we're not going to spend any time here, but just keep in mind that vaccines, especially our live vaccines, can remain or have some residual virulence with them and can cause animals to become sick, or if given at the wrong time, can cause problems in those animals. And then the last thing I just want to mention, so most of the vaccine risks we've talked about so far have to deal with the animal, but I do want to mention, since is that vaccines on occasion can cause problems in humans if we accidentally inject ourselves, and we need to keep this always in mind. In fact, on that label that we talked about earlier, all vaccines on their label will talk about what should happen should you accidentally inject yourself with the vaccine. And 2 of the most famous ones for causing problems in humans are the vaccines against Banks disease or Brucella abortus, and then also Johne's disease vaccines. And in fact, this picture here is a picture of the finger of a gentleman who accidentally injected himself with a Johne's vaccine, and essentially led to the necrosis of the end of his finger. So vaccines need to be taken seriously with respect to human health as well as cattle health. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about very briefly is just the importance of properly designing a vaccine program and what we must consider when deciding what vaccines to use or what vaccines to recommend. And I just really have one slide here, and I just want everybody to understand that designing a vaccine program requires lots of different things to be thought about, okay? And here in the middle I have our vaccine protocol for our dairy operation here at Michigan State, and it's a fairly simple vaccine program. Doesn't look like it's complicated, but there's lots of things that were considered when designing that vaccine program. And the arrows here actually point out some of the considerations that need to be thought about when designing a vaccine program. So it starts with what are the risks of disease in the operation? What are the risks of this farm actually having the diseases that we have vaccines against? Okay, what are some of the disease problems that are problem regionally within, say, the state of Michigan or within the state of California? What diseases are problematic within those areas? We have to think about the farm goals. Okay, is this a commercial operation, or is this a purebred operation that may be selling seed stock or maybe showing animals at the World Dairy Expo? Because how we design a vaccine program for those operations may be much different than a commercial operation. Risk acceptance. Okay, how much risk is the owner willing to accept with respects to infectious disease? Are they very risk averse, or are they very risk tolerant? That goes into trying to decide what the vaccine program ought to look like. Obviously, we got to keep in mind the cost of the vaccines. Some vaccines are relatively inexpensive, so including them doesn't create much of a financial burden, whereas some vaccines are very costly, and really considering or including them in a vaccine program should be considered carefully because of the significant economic cost. We also need to keep in mind whether a vaccine is effective or not. There are some vaccines out there, to be honest with you, that are just not very effective. And so including them in a vaccine program may not be very wise, just because they're probably not going to do what you're hoping for. And then obviously we need to keep in mind vaccine timing. When's the proper time to administer a vaccine to our different production groups? And I would encourage everybody to have a very solid relationship with their veterinarian, because veterinarians are trained in basically working through the development of vaccine protocols. They have the microbiological background, they have the immunological background, hopefully they have the farm background to really help you in designing a good vaccine program. So, last thing I'll leave with you, and I just come back to my tool bag. Remember, vaccines are a tool that we use for disease control in our dairy operations. They're one tool amongst many other tools that we need to have. They can be a very effective tool, but for them to be effective, we need to make sure that we're using them properly. So with that, I will end, and I know we're at 1:55, at least on my clock, so at this point I certainly would entertain any questions from our attendees.
So I see we have someone typed in a question here, Dan.
Yep, I can see it. So the question is, are there any killed viral vaccines, and are they commonly used? And the answer is yes. There are many killed viral vaccines out there, and they are commonly used. And they certainly have their place in both dairy and beef operations. They can be very effective when used properly, and certainly we do recommend them in certain situations. I will say, however, and this is my personal opinion, is that given the choice, I typically recommend that modified live viral vaccines be used, at least to establish initial immunity in cattle. Killed vaccines can be very effective, especially as follow-up vaccines in operations. But if we can start a vaccine program in young animals, especially in replacement animals, with a modified live vaccine, I think we do a better job of setting a very strong baseline immunity in those animals. And then killed vaccines can be used at future times to re-stimulate an immune response. Thank you for that question.
I have a question for you, Dan, while they're typing their response to you in there. Obviously, there's quite a few things you've talked about today. If you were to say what are the top 3 or 4 that dairy farmers in particular, need to pay attention to with vaccines?
So probably the first thing, number one, is work very closely with your veterinarian in developing a vaccine program that fits your operation. No one vaccine, there's no cookie-cutter vaccine program. I believe that we can just say, this is what you ought to be doing. You know, as I mentioned in the one slide, there are a lot of different things that need to be thought about when designing a vaccine program, and I truly believe that your veterinarian can help you guide you through that process. So that's number one. Number two, the veterinarians aren't going to be administering the vaccines, So then it becomes really important that the vaccines are being administered properly. So this is, the proper handling, the proper refrigeration, proper site of administration, the timing, all those things that we talked about with respect to why vaccines fail. So really understanding how vaccines are handled and administered properly will help to increase the chance that the vaccines are going to work effectively. So if there's two things, and those are actually two things that I talk about a lot with our students and I talk about at producer meetings, is work closely with the veterinarians in getting a proper vaccine program developed for your operation. And number two, work really, really hard on proper handling and administration of those vaccines.
I think common sense goes a long way also. You mentioned the cooler itself, and a lot of times freezer packs are used in there. We want to make sure, if I remember correctly from BQA, you don't want your vaccine touching that freezer pack. There needs to be a little bit of layer. We always use bubble wrap, but keep the cooler cool.
Right.
But the vaccine is not on the freezer pack.
Yep, that is correct. And the reason for that is it probably won't freeze the vaccine, but it could reduce the temperature to close to a freezing temperature, which could damage the vaccine or the antigens in that vaccine and make it less effective. So absolutely right. Thank you for that. We have a freezer pack in our cooler. We could put a towel in there. We could put bubble wrap around the vaccine. Anything basically to make sure that we don't have direct contact with that ice pack is certainly warranted.
Well, Dan, we thank you very much for today's webinar and for being part of our series. You have a lot of very good information there, and that farmers can go home and apply. So with that, I'd like to conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for everybody for attending.